All right, so one of the biggest changes
From one based Gary to another, we're going to watch some Gary Stevenson to start off with.
in the economy in the last 20, 30 years has been an enormous increase in asset prices. That is most visible in house prices, but it's important to understand that it's actually happened in pretty much all assets. There's been a massive increase in stock prices, there's been a massive increase in land prices, there's been a massive increase in the gold price. And while I'm filming this in London, there's been a lot of focus in the UK on London. It's important to realize that increase has been pretty much international. We've seen a big increase in house prices and stock prices all over Europe, the US, all over the Western world. Now, this is what I call the asset economy. The reason I call it this is because asset prices have increased enormously in the last 30 years and wages have only increased a bit, we have moved into a new kind of economy where increasingly the work that you do is not really that important for determining how rich you are. Increasingly, the only thing that matters is how many assets your family has. I think the best way to explain this is probably through giving an example. So if you are living here in London and you make...
What? Are you saying that it's more profitable to own the means of production and to let other people work to be able to make the money than it is to actually do the work and be productive in the first place? That's a weird thing to notice, isn't it, Gary? It's not weird. Don't you find that weird?
70, 80 grand, so 2-3 times average income. So you've got a really good job, a really good wage. Increasingly, it is almost impossible to buy property without being able to get some significant help from your family, unless you can get a big cash gift from your parents, or at the very least have a long period of staying with your parents and not having to pay rent. On the flip side, if you are from a very wealthy family, what you will see is even if you have a pretty average paying job, 20, 30 grand, a lot of people from those kinds of families can quite easily buy property because they can get big gifts, £500,000, £600,000 from their family. So what that means is, increasingly we're in a situation where basically for determining how rich you are, the kind of job you have, the kind of degree you have, increasingly doesn't really matter. All that really matters is how many assets your family has. So we're moving away from an economy where your financial outcomes for you as an individual, for your family, were primarily determined by your job and your salary. And we've moved towards an economy where the financial outcomes for individuals are increasingly overwhelmingly determined.
Oh, one thing I will criticise from this video so far, though, is saying that we're just moving towards it now, as if this hasn't been the case ever since the neoliberal reforms of the 80s.
Determined by the amount of assets a family has. Now, in other videos...
And again, the root of all of this is the marketisation. It's over-marketisation of these specifically the housing market, because I think this is mostly where he's coming from here. Obviously, rises in things like new stock prices has all come from how much quantitative easing has been pumped into the pockets of the rich by the Conservative government in recent years, and to a lesser extent by the Labour Party as well in the wake of the financial crisis. With homes specifically, it's because they've been over-marketised. It's because of the reduction in council properties. It's because it's become because of right to buy in the sell-off during the Thatcher era. If there was a way of being able to force asset prices down by having such a large state sector involved, it wouldn't be a problem. But it is a problem now because there's been too much marketisation of this asset specifically.
I've referred to this concept as the end of capitalism. What I mean when I say that was, my parents and my...
I'm sorry, I think that's how capitalism works, Gary.
Grandparents, they lived in a world where, really, regardless of your background, if you were willing and able to work really hard, you could save up some money, buy a house. If you're willing to work really, really hard, you can even get rich. Increasingly, for my generation and for future generations, that will be impossible. So we've moved away from this kind of capitalistic idea of meritocracy, work hard, get rich. We're moving towards really an economy which is primarily about inherited wealth.
Okay, well, maybe he's not a Marxist then, because otherwise he would know that that's literally how capitalism has always worked. Ever since, Engels was owning his factory in Manchester or whatever it was, it was still, under the capitalist mode of production, far more profitable to own the factory and to let other people do the work for you than it was to be the worker in the factory. And there was still a very large stratification between the two. Maybe you could say that the golden age of capitalism, the post-war social democratic consensus, was that this distinction was minimized, but that distinction was still there.
I've called this a new feudalism. we're moving into an economy which is an asset economy. You can only be rich if you were born rich. If you were born poor, you will definitely die poor. Now, in my opinion, this is the biggest economic trend.
I mean, that is more likely in a neoliberal economy than a social democratic economy. Even under a social democratic economy, the biggest predictor of your overall net wealth will be how rich your parents are. I fucking warned you, dude. I told you, bro. My favorite Karl Marx quote.
The last 20, 30 years, it's going to continue. So if you want to understand the economy of today and the future, you need to understand the asset economy. Next step, how did we get here? How did we move into an asset economy? Now, this is actually what I wrote my thesis on this when I was at Oxford. This is actually the thing I've looked at most in my time as an economist. So it's something I'm really interested in. I'm really happy to be able to explain it. The reason that we've moved into an asset economy is because of the massive increase in wealth inequality in the last 30 years. This has happened for a few different reasons. The three main reasons I would point out is, number one, massive decreases in the effective tax rates of the very rich in the 80s under the Thatcher government here in the UK and the Reagan government in the 80s. The increased integration between Western economies.
It's worth pointing out that the Gini coefficient increased under New Labour, but things got more unequal under New Labour. Just because we had like personal debt-driven, overall kind of nominal GDP growth over the course of the first 10 years of the Labour government, doesn't mean that people weren't getting kind of relatively poorer over that period, especially amongst the working classes. But there was enough kind of some amount of positive growth outside of that, so that people didn't really notice just how rich the rich were becoming, and then it all fell into sharp relief when the financial crisis happened.
Like UK, Europe, US, and much more unequal economies like India or particularly China. And thirdly, the mismanagement of massive crises like the 2008 crisis and the COVID crisis in such a way that they led to massive increases.
I think the problem, the mismanagement was not just came as a result of the crisis in 2008. It was the mismanagement that led up to and laid the foundations for the financial crisis, and the fact that the growth that we were having was not proper, like investment-led growth that was going to help the bottom up. It was top-down growth under a neoliberal framework that was championed by Tony Blair and is again being championed by fucking Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves.
In wealth for the very rich, and that's something I've talked about a lot on this channel. So once you have a massive increase in the wealth of the very rich, what that means is you get a very rich class that has a huge amount of assets and they have huge amounts of passive income. So we always use as our example Rishi Sunak. He's worth about 700 or 800 million pounds.
Oh, talk about landlords. Talk about landlords, Gary.
He will generate passive income every year of something like 20, 30 million pounds. Very rich people with big passive incomes, they tend to use the vast majority of those incomes to buy the rest of the assets. What that means is all of this money trying to buy assets, it pushes asset prices up. Those super rich buy the assets of the middle class, which makes them even richer, which pushes asset prices up even more. So because of the dynamics of this, once the rich get very rich, they buy more assets, which makes them richer, which means they buy more assets still. What you get is a spiraling nature. So the rich will get richer, and over time, the middle class will increasingly lose their assets, which means asset prices will go up and up and up, wages will go down and down. If you want to know more about this, you can watch our video, How Wealth Inequality Affects the Economy. But the primary thing you need to understand is, once the rich get very rich, asset prices go up, ordinary families lose their wealth, and this gets worse and worse over time. So understanding the asset economy will help you predict the future, because the asset...
Yeah, that's a good point, JD. I mean, it isn't mismanagement, it's the system working as intended. Yeah, the rich got richer out of 2008. The only reason why we ever didn't have that before the 1980s is because having social democratic governments was working against the system. As far as I'm concerned, a social democratic government or a social democratic party should fundamentally exist to be the bulwark of capitalism's negative effects against the working class without dismantling capitalism. It should be a workers' government for a workers' state, as far as I'm concerned. That's what a social democratic government should be. That's why anyone who is calling people like, Tony Blair, or possibly even people like Harold Wilson, social democratic, fundamentally misunderstand the point of social democracy, as opposed to liberalism, right? I would fundamentally, that's why I call myself, on my Twitter account, a classical social democrat. And as I said, I think it was on the last stream I mentioned that, the SPD in Germany only abandoned Marxism in the 60s. Social democracy and social democratic parties have fundamentally, in their history, have been Marxist parties. I mean, fucking the Mensheviks, right? And I guess the Bolsheviks too, members of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. The Social Democratic Party should fundamentally exist to be the vanguard of the workers in government, but to try and reform rather than be the agitators for a revolutionary fervour, right? That's really the role of a social democratic government. And that is essentially why, under the post-war consensus, we didn't have this thing, because the system was not working as intended. It was that the dampeners upon capitalism were being exercised by a government that existed specifically to counteract them.
Economy is going to be more and more what the future looks like. Part 3, what does the asset economy mean for you, for your family? So I think the number one consequence of an asset economy is that upward social mobility becomes almost impossible. And the reason for that is quite obvious, right? Because as asset prices go up and up and up, up and up and up, much faster than your wages, it simply becomes impossible to buy assets with your wages. And that means that unless you already have assets, you can't get assets. Now, when I say social mobility is impossible, what I mean is it's basically impossible to move upwards in class. So if you look at a very small scale, if you consider two people from very poor families, if one of them gets a 30 grand a year job and one of them gets a 60 grand a year job, that person with a much higher salary will be able to live a more comfortable life, but it will not be enough to be able to buy assets and move up into a permanently higher asset owning position for them and their family in the long run. So if we only look at ourselves and people in a very similar situation to us, it looks like a meritocracy. But once you start looking at yourself and...
The problem is, though, when you put it in terms of things like checks and balances, JDM, it makes people think that that is like an inherent part of the system itself. As if, I mean, I understand what you mean, but the idea of having a social democratic party in government who counteract capitalism, they are fighting. It's not something that keeps the system in line. They are deliberately fighting against the system. I mean, I guess you call that checks and balances, but I would just simply frame it as, again, as the defense against capitalism. But I see your point.
People born with higher wealth, you realize it becomes impossible to move up. So upward social mobility basically ceases to exist. And you're already seeing this massively now. When I look at the people around me in my life, almost everybody my age is at pretty much the exact same position in the financial hierarchy as their parents were. And that is because the most important thing that matters is what assets you inherit from your parents. The other side is, okay, if upward social mobility is impossible, what about downward social mobility? Well, what happens when you have an asset economy is that asset prices go up and up and up and up and up. We still do have a decently sized property-owning middle class in this country. It's largely older people. And these older people find themselves in a situation where there is a massive financial incentive for them to sell their assets because they're sitting on a house that might be worth 500, 600 grand. Living is becoming more difficult. So if they sell that property, they can have a much more comfortable retirement. It looks like they can support their family in their living.
I mean, what's actually going to happen is that these people are going to sell their properties to pay for social care. There is a crisis of social care at the moment. It's only getting more expensive as time goes on. That's why they're going to have to sell their properties, not because they're being incentivized to do so, it's because they have no choice not to, right? And when BlackRock can outbid all of the, the young, upper working class potential homeowners, that's why we're seeing this conglomeration of property assets, right? Like Gary's right, and the existing asset holders, the ones with extra capital, to be able to outbid the rest of us. Also, the people aren't going to have the money anyway. But even if they did, they get outbid. The reason why older people are being forced to sell off their properties because of the crisis in social care. Because there's no other reason for them to sell off, right? Because why sell off your additional property that you own when you could just become a fucking landlord? Why would you do that when you could get rental income? So I think it's missing a trick with this specific framing because, the crisis of social care is fundamentally a huge important part of this.
Living conditions. Now, this reminds me of a Bible story that I was taught when I was a young kid about a guy called Esau, who he was a very strong guy. He was a hunter. He was the eldest son of his family, and he was about to get his inheritance. One day he came home very, very hungry, really starving, and his younger brother, not sure his name, Jacob maybe, said to him, "Listen, I'll give you this food if you let me take your inheritance." And the guy was super hungry, so he gave it away. And then, in trade for being able to enjoy the moment, he lost his basically family's wealth from his side of the family. And this is the situation that older people are finding themselves in now. They are seeing prices go up, but at the same time, their house price is going up. And they're thinking, well, that's okay. I'm making loads of money on the house. If I sell the house, I can live a comfortable life. They, of course, grew up not in the asset economy, in a workers' economy. And they think, well, it's okay because my kids will be able to work hard and buy properties of their own. In reality, because we are in an asset economy...
And that's not a workers' economy. That's just a balanced economy. And I say balance in the loosest sense of the word. A workers' economy would be ones where the workers own the means of production. Sell their homes to pay for care and take out reserve mortgages to make up for poor pensions, yep. Do you think if we tricked Gary into reading Marx, he'd be leading the revolution the next day? I want to go back. I want to get Gary, if you're watching this, please come on and talk Marxism with me. I want to Marx pill you. Let's fucking go.
Economy now, when the older generation of the middle class sell their property, their kids and their grandkids will never be able to buy property again. So what you see is as the richer get richer and richer and richer, more and more of the middle class start to drop away as they sell their assets to the rich. And ultimately, inevitably, if the rich are buying the assets, they must be getting them from somewhere. And this is because people in the middle class are dropping off. So the way it affects you is that we are moving into a world where if your family has no assets, they will never have assets, which means upward social mobility is becoming impossible. But increasingly,
I also want to point out to everybody, there was a solution for the social care crisis. It was called a national care service. Guess whose manifesto the social care service was in? Strange, weird, isn't it? Okay, everyone bully him on Twitter to come on the stream.
increasingly, as the rich get richer and richer, they take the assets of the middle class, which means inevitably my grandkids and your grandkids, unless you are Rishi Sunak, I don't know if you watch my videos, your grandkids will be poor. So next we're going to talk about how this looks from the perspective of the old and the perspective of the young, because I think it looks very, very different from both of those perspectives. Now, older people who in many cases own property, they often look at the asset economy and they see the house price going up and up and up and they think, happy days, you know, I'm really rich. Well done me for being so smart to buy property. I'm doing really, really well. And they use that money to pay for their retirement and they sell the property and they live a good life. And they think it's going to be okay because they read stories in the newspapers saying, listen, don't worry. As long as your kids pull their socks up and stop buying avocado toast and stop going to Starbucks, things will be fine. I think it's really important for older people, any older people.
Because one thing when I reacted to his interview with Aaron Bastani, he made what was essentially a Leninist point, which was that, you know, if you want to be able to make these changes, you have to control the government. Like, you have to gain control of the state to be able to enact the sweeping changes that you need to take the wealth away from the rich to be able to redistribute it. I was like, okay.
People watching these videos, any older people in your life, they explain to them, listen, if you sell that property, which is the only way you can actually enjoy the increase in house price, your kids and grandkids will never own property. That is what the asset economy is. If you take a long-term look at history, you will see for most of history, people born poor cannot ever buy assets or property. If you sell your property now, as we move back into the asset economy, your family will be poor forever. So older people who might be happy at seeing house prices going up, please consider the consequence of this is poverty for your family for the rest of time. Okay, so how does it look from the perspective of the young? Now, this is something that I really want to talk about because I think it's really important. Now, we still live with this kind of age, this idea in our society that we live in a meritocracy. You know, we believe that if you work hard, if you save up, if you study hard, you can get rich.
I think what I fundamentally think is that this was never the case. It's always been the case that you are better off in a position where you own the assets rather than when you work. And working was only ever previously a method with which, under capitalism, for you to then buy the assets, so that you move from CMC to MCM as a transaction, right? That was the whole point. What he's moved from is, instead of this idea that asset owning is better than working that we used to have, we now say where asset owning is the only method of acquiring assets is by already being an asset owner. So that's the issue there, is that he's got the main step without recognizing the difference between being the bourgeois and the proletariat was already there to begin with. There's just the ability to become bourgeois as he says, doesn't exist anymore, or is even less existent than it was previously. I mean, yeah. I mean, that's true, Lincoln bio, yeah.
In reality, as we move into the asset economy, it is increasingly difficult, approaching impossible, for anybody born in a poor family to ever become truly rich in the sense of owning assets. I think this creates a very, very difficult...
You've got to think of it, right? I mean, he calls it the new feudalism. How is this any different to, like, Victorian era Britain? The same, like, low-class ability was there, but the same structure of the economy was still there. It was still fundamentally a capitalist economy with the same division of labour.
situation for the mental health of young people. We're telling young people, listen, if you don't make money, it's because you're lazy or because you're dumb. If you can't get rich, it's because you're lazy, it's because you're dumb. And we're giving them a situation where if they're born into the wrong family, it is impossible for them to get rich. And why is it impossible for them to get rich? Well, the reason is, like we said before, even if you're earning a good salary, imagine you're earning 80 grand, you have to pay tax on all of your salary. At the top end, you're paying above 50% when you include national insurance. You save up as much as you can after tax, and you're able to save maybe 10, 15 grand a year. When you go to buy a property, you are competing with young kids from richer families who are getting gifts from their parents of 400.
I was watching a documentary on aging the other day, and all the old people were like, why does no one listen to us pensioners anymore? And I almost died on the spot. One of the big things are the way they are in the UK is because we listen to pensioners too much. Well, exactly. I mean, you look at the fucking... Right, hang on. 2017 UK election results. Let's fucking bring this shit. I bring it up every time, but it never stops being relevant. Right? Results from 2017 election. Aged 18 to 54, right? Labour, Conservative, Labour. Age 55 plus, Tory. And they got they ended up with the government, right? Apart from upper class, middle-aged people, right? Every single other both class and age demographic all voted the fucking Labour Party in 2017, and Theresa May came fucking Prime Minister. This is ridiculous. This is fucking ridiculous. We only listen to pensioners in this country. They have monopoly control over the entire fucking discourse. It's not gerrymandering though, Jim. It's actually just because there's too fucking many of them. Because they're a gigantic generational cohort. They have monopoly control over all of the discourse. Look at this. Look at this. Every single age demographic under 50 voted for Labour. What the fuck? What is this shit?
500, 600 grand cash. That is the equivalent of you saving your after-tax income for 50 years, even if you are on 2 or 3 times the national average. So we are telling young people, if you fail, it's your fault, and we are making it impossible for them to succeed. And I think this is creating, in many cases, a mental health crisis for young people. So I want to send a message out.
I mean, you're absolutely correct, Stuckful. I'm not going to get into class war. I'm not going to get into a generational war. My problem with boomers is not that boomers are somehow inherently bad, right? But they have been given a different set of material interests to the rest of us because of the position that they held within the economy during the neoliberal sell-off in the 1980s. They were the single generational beneficiary of the demutualization of our economy, of the sell-off of council housing, all that kind of stuff, right? They are the Thatcherite generation, and they were given those material interests. And now they've retired. Now that they're all retired, for example, their material interests are now much different from ours too, in that now that they don't work anymore, they have no material interest in voting for pro-worker policies. They're an asset-owning class who rely on pensions rather than an asset-light class who own on the value of their labour. Their material interests are different from people who actually do the work. Now, I'm not saying that means we need to disregard their interests, because we need to look after old people and pensioners fundamentally, because, you know, that's what the social contract demands. What that doesn't mean is that we should allow them to, because there is a fundamental conflict between asset-rich pensioners and asset-light workers, and that has to be reconciled before we can create a unity of an electoral unity against the bourgeois, who are the real problem. It's super fucking difficult to try and triangulate these positions. Like they're like, you know, there are loads of amazing pensioners, politically active pensioners in this country, and I love them. Fucking Audrey White, we fucking stan Audrey White and the Merseyside Pensioners Alliance, right? But it's really super difficult to try and, you know, square the circle of the gigantic generational differences in wealth. It's like that one clip of the retired GP at the NHS protests. Your age doesn't matter, it's what you believe. Unfortunately, with baby boomers, those two things are broadly correlate. Like, hang on a minute, if I go to Financial Times, left, right. So if I think if I can find this one. Where's the one I'm looking for? Fucking Ecosia is so bad. That's not the result I wanted. Google Images it is. This is the one, right? Oh, fuck's sake. So look at this graph here, right? Obviously, this specifically talks about millennials, for example, getting more left-wing over time. They read print media and the media onslaught was insane. I can't blame them too much. Well, that's true, but again, it also, you know, it wasn't in their material interest to do so either. Like when people keep saying, "Oh well, Labour have lost the red wall because they've become the party of liberalism or whatever." Well, that's complete nonsense. The reason why Labour lost the red wall in 2019 is because they were always losing the red wall. The red wall has gotten older, they're more likely to be homeowners, right? People in the red wall seats have all moved out of the red wall. All the young people have moved out of the red wall because there's no fucking jobs left in the manufacturing sector into the large cities, and that's what's happened. That's what's happened there, right? Being old can be scary and the right all about the politics of fear. That's also true. That's also true, Lincoln Bayou. One thing I would point out here, though, when JDM points out the age doesn't matter, it's what you believe, unfortunately with baby boomers, these two things broadly correlate. Look at this graph here. Don't look at the millennials bit. Look at the difference between the boomer and the silent generation. Silent generation, right, lived through the war, lived through the building of the welfare state, lived through the building of the NHS and the creation of the greatest kind of period in our country's existence, in the wake of what happened in the Second World War. The boomers didn't live through any of that shit. They were the beneficiaries of it, and then also the beneficiaries of when all of those goods were sold off in the 1980s. And that's why the silent generation are far less right-wing than boomers are. You can see how people's material interests and their material conditions have changed their political beliefs just by this graph here. Well, I'm not saying they're a monolith. You've got to understand me on my own. Whenever I talk about this stuff, I'm always talking in terms of demographic trends rather than some kind of, unifying specific thing that applies to everybody. But you can see here why this generation in specific are so specifically right wing. It's all the fucking 1980s. It's the 1980s. These people, a lot of these people would have voted for fucking the Jim Callahan in '79. But these are Thatcher's children. I don't think more property necessarily means more selfish beliefs, but the creation of a political, of a manufactured political position or political system which rewards selfish behavior and teaches people that being selfish is good, in amongst the same time as a gigantic public sector sell-off that fundamentally benefited one specific generation in society, was a maelstrom that created the boomer generation and the kind of politics that we see in right here, and the difference between these two lines right here. This is far more important to me than what this is. Okay, now where's my rear end? Grew up in Merseyside in the Thatcher years and quickly understood the cruelty of neoliberalism. That's why Liverpool is my favourite place in the UK, because you can go there and you can say hi to people and you're not going to accidentally shake the hand of a fucking Tory. Although the US millennials are getting more left wing over even more left wing over time. Whereas there is some kind of plateau. I think like leftist millennials, are going to stay probably in this kind of area for quite a while. But in the US, you can see millennials actually in their 30s are more right wing than they are in their 40s. Well, yeah, exactly. Like this is the oh shit, the meritocracy was a lie point. Woo. They did an interesting study on money and feelings. Control group had to count out slips of blank paper with somebody, and afterwards they were told the other person didn't like you and the hurt feelings were recorded. When they tested people counting out stacks of money, the testy didn't care at all that the other person didn't like them. Fucking hell. Tories from Liverpool are a special level of mental. Paul Nuttall of the UKIPs. True. I mean, yeah, like you have to be a special kind of kind of awful to have a look at the shit that happened in fucking Hillsborough and that shit, and to come out of it a fucking Tory. Why Gen X getting so reactionary? I'm not sure. I mean, hopefully this trend will reverse, but they're looking like they're going to be possibly even more right wing than boomers, and that's probably a result of the economic policies of Tony Blair. All the fucking landlords. Yeah, but have you not seen what old school punks are like right now? Like, old school punks are all fucking reactionary as shit. It's like the only like old school punk that nowadays seem to still be right on his Jello Biafra. I mean, look at fucking fucking Johnny Rotten doing adverts for butter and becoming a Trump supporter. What's happening to the punks of the 80s? What's happening to the punks of the 80s in the Gen X as Gen Xers is exactly what's happening to the hippies and the boomer generation. No material analysis, all conspiracy theory shit, and so they fundamentally have become the kind of reactionary people that watch that get pandered to by people like Russell Brand, right? And also they got money. You live in the southwest now, so a guy with Margaret Thatcher tattooed on his leg. Fucking hell, Jesus. But yeah, like fundamentally, if you want to understand the boomers, you have to look at the difference between the generation that preceded them, not any of the other generations that came after them. Oh yeah, you better believe the Conservatives are dying out, and Labour Party will too, unless they unless they change tack.
Out here to young people, especially young people from poor or ordinary backgrounds, okay? If you are feeling like...
I think what's fundamentally different between Tom Morello, and a lot of the punks of a similar era is that Tom Morello's dad is from fucking Kenya, so,
You are poor and other people around you are rich, that is not your fault. You have been given a system where it is impossible for people born into poor families to get rich. So if you're not happy about that, you need to come and help us change the system. That is what this channel is here for. If the system as it is continues, people from poor families will never be able to escape poverty. This is not your fault. This is a system that makes it impossible for you. Support us and help us change that system. Now, the very last point, which is something I think that is super, super interesting, which is in the asset economy, for very sensible, understandable reasons, people and families become very, very protective of their assets. And that is because if you are a family in an asset economy with no assets, your whole family, your descendants forever are consigned to definite poverty. So obviously you want to protect your assets as much as you can, because if you lose those assets, then your family is going to be devastated forever. And what that leads to is actually people doing things which are actually very counter their interests. For example, many people, because they are very protective of their own assets, will, for example, oppose things like wealth taxes, which we support on this channel. And once you understand the asset economy, you can totally understand why they're doing that. They're sitting there thinking, oh my God, if I lose these assets, then my family is going to be devastated. So I absolutely have to protect these assets. And in so doing, they oppose increasing taxation on the richest. And remember that the wealth of the richest is growing and growing and growing. And if you don't do anything about that, it is inevitable that they will outcompete the middle class for assets in the long term. It's a little bit like if we're sitting here in this room and there's a massive balloon that is growing and growing and growing at an accelerating rate, and it's starting to squash us all, taking up all the oxygen in the room, and we're sitting here with a little balloon in our pocket saying, we can't do anything that will hurt balloons. You see, if you don't do anything about this massively spiraling growing wealth of the very rich, remember, just Rishi Sunak alone gets a passive income of £40 million. They will inevitably.
I mean, literally, he is literally talking about fucking £80,000 guy. The kind of person that Gary is talking about here is literally fucking this guy. Like, they're gonna tax me over £80,000 a year more, and I'm like, I'm not even the top half of earners.
Inevitably take all the assets in the long term. That means we will.
I never cared about money much, but I wanted to be able to live comfortably, and I thought I'd have no real trouble doing that. Thought I could avoid the rat race and sort of have done, but now in my mid-50s, I found myself in a position where an easier life is always going to be difficult. Well, that buffer zone that was required to get through the cost of living crisis has all been eaten up by the pandemic. It's unfortunate.
Lose our middle class, and we will end up as a country which is.
This is what universal basic services. It's the future.
Filled with poverty. The only way to protect the middle class is to keep the wealth of this country flowing through the country generation after generation. If you allow the rich to slowly accumulate and grow and take all of the wealth, it is inevitable that ordinary families will lose theirs in the long term. But at the same time, I'm very understanding of why people want to protect their wealth. And that is why on this channel, we always make it very clear, look, we're not trying to tax ordinary working people, even if you might be a doctor, a lawyer, or heaven forbid, a banker. We are out here trying to tax very, very wealthy families with wealth of 10, 100, £1 billion. Super, super wealthy families. These are the guys who, if you don't tax them, their wealth will grow and grow, and over the long run, they will end up taking the wealth of the middle class. So if you allow the super rich to grow their wealth forever, unless you already are super rich, you will lose your wealth in the long run and your kids will be poor. The only way to protect working people in this country, including asset owners, is to keep wealth flowing around. So listen, I would encourage you, even if you do have wealth of your own, you need to support greater tax.
Like, he's correct in that, you know, a wealth tax is something that is going to be necessary. But unless you make structural changes to the economy, the inherent contradictions within capitalism as a political and economic framework is going to lead to them being reversed, and we are seeing the same trend happening all over again, right? The change needs to happen from decommodification. There needs to be a fundamental restructuring of the housing market overall, right? Fundamental restructuring. We need to essentially make sure that landlords are non-existent, because they are massive asset holders who have a financial incentive to become even more asset holders, right? It doesn't matter whether it's BlackRock, it doesn't matter whether it's a small-time landlord, don't care, they need to fucking go. And then we need to use the existence of state housing to ensure that the asset prices stay low. Oh, I get private healthcare insurance through my job as well. Actually, I get remunerations for private healthcare that I use. I have Medicash. You think Gen X were destroyed by the world of social mobility and continual societal progress promised? By our parents disappearing before our eyes, generational neoliberal trauma. And the problem is that Gen X was so much so, Gen X still were of the era that kind of fundamentally believed in capitalism. It's the Gen Xers who have been pushed to the alt-right, because they fundamentally still believe in capitalism economic system, but they don't quite understand that neoliberalism is at fault here. So instead of blaming the inherent contradictions that are part of the system that's failed, they must believe that there's some kind of fifth columnist who's trying to destroy the system from the inside, which is why so many Gen Xers believe in the fucking, like, World Economic Forum, Great Reset style shit, rather than just, you know, blaming capitalism like millennials and Zoomers do.
Taxation of the rich and the super rich. If you do not, then they will take your wealth. The only way to protect your wealth is to stop the super wealthy from taking it. And if you allow them to accumulate more and more wealth without paying any tax, it is inevitable that they will do that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. The asset economy, this is a theory which I've used to help me understand the economy for a long time. I've made a lot of money of it. I think most economists don't understand it. If you understand it, I think you can have a really good understanding of what's happening. Most important thing to understand, it will get worse. Asset prices will go up, the rich will get richer, the middle class will become dispossessed. And that.
So I think my response to this really is, yeah, you're correct, right? He's correct in the way he's described the economy. But wealth taxes are only one part of the change. Wealth taxes, decommodification, which means huge, like, first step is huge amounts of new social housing. New council housing needs to be created. We need to essentially make sure landlords don't exist anymore by overtaking them with social rent, for example. And we need to fundamentally rebalance the economy overall. And things like universal basic services. Decommodification is the important bit here. We need to change, because again, if we don't fundamentally change the economy, it'll just go back to this all over again.
That includes you, So I would encourage you, whether you are from a poorer background or whether you are from a middle class background, support this channel, get behind us, support us, follow us and everything we've got. What have we got now? TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, of course. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, these landlords' next career could be in cyber.
Yeah, follow it, share this video, because if we don't stop this, the situation gets worse. I don't want it to happen. Hopefully you don't want it to happen. If you are Rishi and you're watching these videos, thank you for your support. Otherwise, we need to stop it, because it's the only way to support our futures and our families. Thank you.
So to make a point, right? I think what's important to to understand why the bit that I'm critiquing Gary for here, where he's trying to tell us that this specific paradigm is only something that's happened recently rather than something that is a fundamental part of capitalism. Capital Chapter 4 has a really important part where he talks about a model with which we understand how people make money, right? So we've got to understand the difference between CMC and MCM transactions. So what C means commodity, M means money, right? So a worker trades their commodity, which is their labor, for money in the form of their wages, which then gets turned back into commodities, which they purchase, for example, right? Whereas when you are a member of the bourgeois, you start off with money, right? You invest that into commodities, namely capital, right? And to put that into owning the means of production, gaining more assets, for example, which you then will turn into more money, either through capital gains or through rent, for example. And obviously the M, so that means the M, it'll be something that you'll end up with more money than you did at the start. And that's how you know. And that is the fundamental difference between the bourgeois and the proletariat under capitalism, and the fundamental difference between workers and asset holders under capitalism. Isn't capital the book where Marx goes on and on about textile manufacturing? For me, I've lost the spark of enthusiasm for finding something that is satisfying and sustain you. The renter economy, the hustle culture is getting worse and worse, it seems. That's a really important point, MCH, in that because work has been so disincentivized through poor pay, pure remuneration, poor benefits, over-taxation, for example, when, on the contrary, being a rentier and engaging in capital gains, engaging in, taking money from dividends, for example. The basic rate of tax for dividend payouts is 8.75% versus 20% for earning income. Why the fuck would you work when you're going to get taxed more than double you would if you just made money off of dividend payouts? Capital gains is only 10%, whereas the basic rate of income tax is 20%. So you're getting taxed double for making money off of actually working and being productive than you would if you just made money off capital gains. So not only are you getting a better return based upon the MCM model, right? You're also being taxed less. It's nonsensical. But you're absolutely right. Like, when work doesn't pay, work isn't a vocation. It's like, why would anybody have any enthusiasm for finding something that's satisfying and can sustain you when it's not even, you don't get good benefits, you don't get good remuneration, and there's no future, there's no future progression from there. There's no level of satisfaction. And fundamentally, right, the disparity between CMC and MCM is why, so many things, why there needs to be a certain level of decommodification in our economy to keep the difference between assets and working income from expanding, right? That's what the social democratic post-war consensus did, and that's what neoliberalism has reversed for the last 45 years now. The lower tax for capital gains was meant to account for the supposed increased risk of loss on capital purchase. Tough shit. If you want to gamble on your capital, fuck it. If you make income, we shouldn't we shouldn't reward you for getting income from being not unproductive. We have a crisis of productivity in this country, and we have a government who's happy to continually giving essentially tax breaks to people who don't even fucking work. They don't even pay national insurance on this shit. Right? Not only do we tax workers more on a basic rate regardless, we also put national insurance on top of that as well, which you don't even do for pensioners.